The key turned in the lock with a familiar, heavy clunk, a sound that was the very essence of home. Erica Adams shouldered her overstuffed duffel bag across the threshold, the scent of lemon polish and yesterday's coffee wrapping around her like a worn blanket. Summer stretched before her, a blank canvas of lazy days, and this house, with its slightly sagging porch and hydrangeas in desperate need of deadheading, was her anchor. Her childhood bedroom awaited, a time capsule of high school trophies and faded band posters, a sanctuary from the relentless pace of her sophomore year. Her parents emerged from the kitchen in a synchronized flutter of welcome. Her mother, Linda, wiped her hands on a checkered apron, her smile crinkling the corners of her eyes as she pulled Erica into a hug that smelled of rosemary and garlic. Her father, Mark, stood back, his own grin wide and easy, before enveloping them both in a bear hug that made Erica's duffel bag slide to the floor. Dinner was a ritual of comfortable chaos. The old oak table bore the scars of 1,000 family meals, and tonight it groaned under a feast of meatloaf, creamy mashed potatoes, and green beans almondine, a menu curated from Erica's most requested childhood favorites. The conversation flowed with the easy rhythm of long familiarity. Erica recounted the absurdities of her final exams, the drama of her roommate's on-again, off-again relationship, her tentative plans for a summer internship at the local library. Mark talked about the ongoing saga of the leaky faucet in the downstairs bathroom, a project that had somehow spanned 3 seasons. Linda chimed in with news from the neighborhood, the Johnsons' new puppy, the Mitchells' roof repair. Laughter echoed against the yellow-walled kitchen, warm and genuine. Erica watched her parents in the soft glow of the overhead light, seeing the new threads of silver in her father's hair, the gentle lines that had deepened around her mother's mouth since Christmas. They were her constants, her foundation. The feeling of being utterly, unconditionally known settled over her, as comforting as the well-worn flannel of her father's shirt. It was during a lull, as Mark cleared the plates and Linda brought out a homemade apple pie, that the first hairline crack appeared in the evening's perfect glaze. Erica, scooping vanilla ice cream, made an offhand comment about a genetics project she'd found fascinating. "It just makes you think about what you inherit, you know." She mused, the tines of her fork tracing patterns in the condensation on her water glass. Not just eye color or whatever, but predispositions, medical stuff. Did Grandma Adams have that heart condition, or was that Great-Aunt June? Mark's movements at the sink didn't falter, but Linda, who was slicing the pie with precise, careful motions, went very still for a fraction of a second. The knife hovered. "Oh, you know, it's hard to remember," Linda said, her voice a note too bright. She slid a perfect wedge of pie onto Erica's plate. "Your father's side always had sturdy constitutions. My mother had some arthritis later on, but that's about it." She didn't meet Erica's eyes, focusing instead on the next slice. Erica shrugged, the thought fleeting. "Just curious, this project had us all mapping hypothetical family trees. Mine would be pretty boring, I guess." "Boring is good," Mark said, turning from the sink with a dish towel in his hands. His smile was warm, but his eyes flicked toward Linda for a heartbeat. "Boring means healthy and happy." Linda quickly steered the conversation toward safer waters, asking about Erica's friends, their summer plans. Yet a subtle tension had seeped into the room, thin as cigarette smoke. Erica noticed it in the way her mother's hands fluttered nervously to her necklace, a simple gold chain she always wore. She saw it in the extra beat her father took before answering a simple question about his work. It was nothing concrete, nothing she could articulate. Just a feeling, a slight atmospheric shift, as if a door had been quietly closed in a distant part of the house. Later, as she lay in her old bed, the streetlight casting familiar shadows of the oak tree branches onto her ceiling, Erica replayed the moment. Her mother's hesitation, the swift change of subject. It was probably nothing. Linda had been stressed lately. She'd mentioned it on the phone last week, work deadlines, planning for her own mother's upcoming visit, the weight of everyday life. Erica had simply caught her at a tired moment. She rolled over, burying her face in the pillow that still smelled faintly of her lavender detergent from home, her dorm. The unease, a tiny, cold pebble in her gut, was easily dismissed. It was just family, it was just stress. It was a Monday like any other, the start of a safe, predictable summer. The foundation was solid, it had to be. She willed herself to believe it as sleep began to pull her under, the distant sound of her parents' muffled voices from downstairs, a soothing, familiar lullaby. The summons came 2 days later, wrapped in the guise of a chore. Erica was sprawled on the living room floor, textbooks and highlighters arrayed around her in a semi-serious attempt at pre-summer semester review, when her mother's voice floated down the hallway. "Honey, if you're looking for something to do, the attic could really use a going over." Erica looked up. Her mother stood in the doorway, clutching a feather duster like a scepter. There was a tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there during Monday's dinner laughter. "It's just accumulated so much junk over the years. I thought we could sort through, maybe donate some things, make some space." It was a reasonable request, a classic summer break task. Yet something in the delivery felt off, a little too casual, a little too rehearsed. Erica marked her page and closed the book. "Sure, Mom, I can start this afternoon." The pull-down ladder groaned in protest as she released it from its ceiling hatch, a cloud of dust motes swirling into the slanted afternoon light. The air that wafted down was hot, still, and carried the scent of aged paper, mothballs, and forgotten things. Erica climbed into the dim, triangular space, the wooden beams of the roof pressing close overhead. The attic was a landscape of memory covered in sheeting. Boxes labelled Christmas decorations and Mark's College were stacked next to an old rocking horse missing a rocker and a lamp with a fringed shade that had once lived in her grandmother's parlour. Sunlight filtered through a small, grimy gable window, illuminating dancing dust. Erica began systematically, creating piles, keep, donate, trash. She worked for over an hour, lost in the nostalgia of old report cards, her ballet recital tutu flattened in a garment bag, a box of her father's vinyl records. It was when she moved a stack of National Geographic magazines, their yellow spines brittle, that she saw it. Tucked behind a broken floor lamp and an old suitcase was a trunk. It was not like the other cardboard boxes. This was a proper steamer trunk, made of dark, scarred wood with rusted metal bands reinforcing its corners. A heavy padlock, dull with tarnish, secured its clasp. It sat there, silent and imposing, a vault in a sea of clutter. Erica dragged it out into the narrow aisle. It was heavier than it looked. She brushed a thick layer of dust from its lid, the particles hanging in the air. There were no labels, no markings. Its very presence felt intentional, a secret placed and then obscured. Her curiosity, a live wire since the dinner table tension, began to hum. She descended the ladder and found her mother in the kitchen, meticulously wiping down already clean counters. "Mom, what's in that wooden trunk in the attic, the locked one?" Linda's hand stilled on the granite. She didn't turn around for a moment. When she did, her smile was a thin, stretched thing. "Oh, that old thing. That's just boring paperwork, sweetheart. Old tax returns, insurance documents from the Stone Age, your father's idea of organized filing." She gave a short, airy laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Nothing interesting. Probably just mouse fodder by now." The answer was too quick, too dismissive. Tax returns were kept in filing cabinets, not locked away in antique trunks in dusty attics. Erica saw the nervous flutter in her mother's throat, the way her fingers twisted the dish towel. "Do you have the key?" Erica asked, keeping her voice light. "Heavens, no, probably lost years ago. Don't worry about it, really. Just leave it be, focus on the other boxes." Linda turned back to the counter, her shoulders rigid. The conversation was clearly, definitively closed. But it was. The trunk, now that she had seen it, exerted a gravitational pull. Its silence was a shout. That evening, after a quiet dinner where her mother talked incessantly about a sale at the garden centre, Erica found herself standing in her parents' bedroom. The house was quiet. Her father was watching a game downstairs, her mother was in the bath. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, only that she was looking. Her eyes scanned the dresser, the nightstands. Then they landed on her mother's jewellery box, a delicate inlaid wood piece that had sat on her vanity for as long as Erica could remember. It held costume jewellery, a few nice pieces for special occasions. It was not a place for important keys. Yet when Erica lifted the lid, the familiar tinkling melody of Greensleeves playing, she saw it immediately. Tucked not in a compartment but under the velvet-lined bottom itself, a slight bulge. She lifted the lining. There, lying alone against the bare wood, was a small tarnished brass key. It was cold and heavy in her palm. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of guilt and exhilaration. This was a line crossed. She took the key, replaced the lining, and closed the box, the music dying with a final, tinny note. She moved like a ghost through the hall and up the ladder, the key burning a hole in her fist. In the attic, the trunk waited. The padlock was stiff. She jiggled the key, her hands trembling. With a gritty, reluctant click, the lock sprang open. She unhooked it, the metal cold against her fingers. Taking a deep breath of the dusty air, she lifted the heavy lid. There was no explosion of moths, no avalanche of yellowed paper. Instead, she was met with a scene of meticulous, almost reverent order. The contents were neatly arranged, preserved. On top lay several manila folders, their edges crisp. Beneath them, she could see the spines of photo albums, not the garish, sticky-paged family albums from downstairs, but simpler, leather-bound ones. There were a few small, flat boxes and a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Everything was clean, dust-free, as if this trunk was not forgotten but visited, curated. And everything, she sensed with a sudden, chilling certainty, predated her. This was an archive from a time before she existed. The air left her lungs. She was not looking at old tax returns. She was looking at a carefully preserved secret. Slowly, she reached for the topmost photo album, her fingertips brushing the cool leather. The leather of the album cover was cool and smooth, a stark contrast to the hot, dusty air of the attic. Erica lifted it from the trunk with a reverence she did not understand, placing it carefully on her lap as she sat back on her heels. The gable window cast a long, thin rectangle of fading afternoon light across the floor, illuminating the swirling dust her movements had disturbed. She opened the cover. The first pages were unremarkable. Photographs of her parents, Mark and Linda, but younger, impossibly younger. Here was her father with hair, her mother without the lines of worry around her eyes. They stood before landmarks, the Grand Canyon, the Liberty Bell, smiling the carefree smiles of young marrieds without children. Erica felt a pang of fond familiarity. This was the history she knew, the prologue to her own story. But as she turned the pages, the scenery changed. The vacations gave way to pictures of a house she did not recognize, a cozy-looking bungalow with a wide porch. Her parents were there, but they were not alone. They were with another couple, a man with a dark, easy smile and a woman whose laughter seemed to echo from the glossy print, her head thrown back, her hand on Linda's arm. The four of them posed with barbecues at Christmas trees on that same porch, holding glasses of lemonade. The intimacy was palpable. These were not casual friends. These were kindred spirits, a quartet. Erica's thumb traced the edge of a photograph where her mother, Linda, had her arm linked with the laughing woman. They looked like sisters. A cold, fine point of unease began to press at the base of her skull. She had never seen these pictures. She had never heard of these friends. She turned another page and the world tilted. It was a simple snapshot, slightly blurry as if taken in a hurry. Mark and Linda. They were standing in what looked like a living room, but not the living room downstairs. They were both looking down, their expressions a mixture of awe and profound tenderness that made Erica's breath catch. They were holding a baby, a tiny infant, swaddled in a white blanket, its face a pink, sleeping moon cradled in the crook of Linda's arm. Mark's hand rested gently on the blanket, his finger near the baby's tiny, curled fist. The date, scrawled in white ink in her mother's neat handwriting in the album's margin, read, April 12. The year was unmistakably 21 years ago. Erica's own birthday was in November. According to every family story, every celebration, she was the long-awaited miracle, born after years of trying. This baby, held with such visceral love by her parents, was dated 7 months before she was supposedly born. A roaring silence filled Erica's ears, drowning out the distant sound of a lawnmower from outside. She stared at the date until the numbers blurred. 7 months. It was a discrepancy too vast to be a mistake, too specific to be an album error. Her eyes were glued to the baby's face, searching for something, anything, in that blurry, newborn anonymity. She felt a bizarre, terrifying sense of dislocation, as if she were looking at a photograph of strangers. With trembling hands, she set the album aside and reached back into the trunk. Her fingers found one of the flat boxes. It was a simple white stationery box. She lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of yellowing tissue paper, were a few delicate items: a pair of tiny silver baby shoes, a lock of fine, dark hair tied with a white thread, and an envelope. The envelope was plain, unsealed. Erica lifted the flap. Inside was not a letter, but a small, rectangular slip of coated paper, its edges worn soft. She pulled it out. It was a hospital bracelet, the kind with a plastic coil and a printed information tab. The plastic was brittle, the print faded but still legible. Her eyes scanned the lines. Baby girl Santos, it read. Then more clearly, Santos Erica. The first name was hers. The last name was not. Santos. Below that was a date of birth, April 10, 2 days before the photo, and a hospital name in a city 2 states away. The bracelet lay in her palm, a tiny, weightless thing that felt as heavy as an anvil. Santos Erica. The name echoed in the silent attic, a ghost knocking to be let in. The cold point of unease at the base of her skull spread, flooding her veins, settling deep in the pit of her stomach with a heavy, physical dread. This was not a forgotten memento of a friend's child. This was not a clerical error. The dates, the name, the secretive preservation, they formed a constellation of facts, and at its center was her own face in the mirror, suddenly unfamiliar. She looked from the bracelet to the open photo album, to the image of her parents, the only parents she had ever known, holding that baby with a love that looked utterly genuine, utterly parental. Who was that baby? The question was a tremor becoming an earthquake. If that baby was her, then the story of her birth was a lie. If that baby was not her, then who was it, and why was its memory, its name, its hair, its bracelet, locked away with such care, hidden from her? The attic, once just a dusty storage space, now felt like a crime scene, and she was both the detective and the evidence. The warm, safe narrative of her life, the story of Mark and Linda Adams and their beloved daughter Erica, cracked open, revealing a dark, hollow space beneath. She carefully placed the bracelet back in its envelope, the tiny shoes, the lock of hair. She closed the box as if it were a reliquary. The cheerful sounds of the neighborhood, children shouting, a dog barking, filtered up through the insulation, a world away. Downstairs, her mother was probably starting dinner, moving in the kitchen that had always been the heart of her home. But that home, those people, now seemed separated from her by a pane of thick, distorting glass. A cold, profound dread solidified inside her, a stone of fear and betrayal that sat heavy and immovable. She had come up here to clean an attic. She was leaving with the terrifying knowledge that she might not know who she was at all. The foundation of her 20 years had just crumbled into dust, silent and final, in the fading light of a forgotten room. The official certificate was where it had always been, filed neatly in the fireproof lockbox on the top shelf of her parents' bedroom closet. Erica's hands were steady now, unnervingly so, a clinical calm that had settled over her after the initial shock in the attic. She carried the lockbox to her own room, closed the door, and placed it on her desk beside the small white stationery box from the trunk. The contrast was stark, the modern gunmetal grey lockbox versus the faded, sentimental stationery box. She opened the lockbox. There were passports, social security cards, the deed to the house. And there in a clear plastic sleeve was her birth certificate. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, a crisp, formal document with a raised seal. Erica Lynn Adams, father Mark Robert Adams, mother Linda Marie Adams née Porter. Date of birth November 17, the hospital in Philadelphia, all the facts of her life authoritative and printed in immutable ink. From the stationery box she extracted the hospital bracelet again. Santos, Erica, date of birth April 10, the city was in New Jersey. She laid the bracelet on the desk. Then, from the leather album, she re-examined the photograph of her parents holding the baby. April 12, 7 months and 5 days of discrepancy. 7 months of unaccounted for life. Erica's mind, trained by 2 years of college-level research, began to work, compartmentalizing the panic. She opened her laptop, the glow of the screen a cold blue in her dimming room. She started with simple searches. Santos and the New Jersey city from the bracelet. The results were a blur of common names, local businesses, a few obituaries for elderly individuals. No obvious connection. She searched the hospital name alongside Santos. Nothing but generic information pages. She tried Carlos and Maria Santos, the names feeling strangely natural on her tongue, but found no relevant digital footprint from 21 years ago. The internet, for all its vastness, offered only silence on this specific, buried point. Each dead-end search, however, spun a wider web of questions. Who were these people? Why was there no trace? The lack of information was itself a kind of answer. It suggested a story deliberately obscured, not merely forgotten. Her eyes drifted between the 2 documents on her desk. The birth certificate was a cornerstone of identity, required for a driver's license, a passport, college enrollment. The bracelet was a fragile, intimate truth, a tag for a wrist that must have been impossibly small. They could not both belong to the same person. One of them was a fiction. The cold stone of dread in her stomach pulsed. If the bracelet was real, then the certificate was a lie. And if the certificate was a lie, then so was everything built upon it. She needed a different kind of evidence, something from the living archives in her own home. Dinner that evening was a subdued affair. Linda had made spaghetti, but the rich aroma of garlic and tomatoes felt cloying to Erica. She pushed the food around her plate, watching her parents. Mark talked about a problem with a spreadsheet at work, his narrative detailed and mundane. Linda nodded along, her smiles small and tight. They were performing normality, and the performance was flawless, which made every gesture seem suspect. Erica saw her opening when her father mentioned a colleague who was out for knee surgery. She swallowed a bite of pasta, forcing her voice to sound casually curious. Hey, Dad, speaking of medical stuff, I was thinking about that genetics project again. We never really talked about our family medical history in detail. Like on your side, was there any history of early onset anything, or specific conditions I should maybe be aware of? Mark Adams froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. It was a microscopic hesitation, but in the hyper-focused lens of Erica's attention, it was a seismic event. He lowered his fork slowly. Early onset? No, I don't think so. The Adams side is pretty robust, long-lived. He took a drink of water. My grandfather had emphysema, but he smoked 2 packs a day for 50 years. What about heart stuff or neurological things? Erica pressed gently, watching his eyes. Not that I know of, he said, but his gaze slid away from hers, landing on the salt shaker. He picked it up, turned it in his fingers, set it down. Your mom's side, Linda, didn't your uncle have that thing with his thyroid? Linda, who had been staring intently at her own plate, jumped slightly. Thyroid? Yes, he did, but that's manageable with medication. Her words came out in a rush. Erica, honey, this is such a morbid topic for dinner. You're young and healthy, you don't need to worry about these things yet. It's not about worrying, it's about knowing, Erica said, her tone still light, a student discussing a project. Knowledge is power, right? So on your side, Mom, anything else? Diabetes? Cancer? Linda's napkin was in her lap, and Erica saw her hands twisting the fabric beneath the table's edge. My mother had arthritis, like I said. My father, he passed from a heart attack, but he was in his 70s. That's not unusual. She stood up abruptly, collecting her plate, though it was still half full. I think I oversalted the sauce. Can I get anyone more water? It was a full-scale retreat. Mark watched her go to the sink, then cleared his throat. Your mom's right, kiddo. No sense borrowing trouble. The best predictor of your health is your own lifestyle. Eat your veggies, get exercise. He attempted a smile, but it was strained, not reaching the familiar crinkles around his eyes. He was floundering, offering platitudes where specifics were asked for. He, the man who could recite baseball statistics from 1986, was stumbling over the basic history of his own lineage, or the lineage he was supposed to claim. The conversation died there, suffocated by the unspoken. Erica helped clear the table in silence. As she passed her father, she caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't decipher, a mixture of profound love and something that looked like fear. It was the fear that confirmed everything. Honest people, when asked about family medical history, might rummage through imperfect memories. They might say, "Gosh, I'm not sure," or "Let me call my sister and ask." They did not stiffen, stumble, and change the subject with palpable anxiety. Back in her room, the 2 documents remained on the desk, illuminated by the desk lamp. The discrepancy was no longer just about dates on paper. It was alive, living in the strained silence at the dinner table, in the fearful glance from her father, in her mother's frantic fabric twisting. The lie had a texture now, a sound, the sound of a conversation carefully deflected, of a story refusing to be told. The official record stated one truth, the hidden bracelet suggested another, and the behavior of the 2 people she trusted most in the world screamed that the hidden thing was real. The foundation was not just cracked, it was built over a void. Erica sat in the circle of lamplight, the phantom weight of a hospital bracelet on a tiny wrist she could not remember, and knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that her parents were afraid of the questions she was only just beginning to ask. The search for answers had moved from dusty attics and digital databases to the very heart of her home, and every evasive glance was another piece of evidence pointing toward a truth she was both desperate and terrified to uncover. The evidence sat on Erica's desk for 2 days, a silent tribunal. The birth certificate, the hospital bracelet, the photograph, they formed a quiet, accusatory circle in the lamplight. She moved through the house like a ghost, observing her parents with new forensic eyes. She noted the careful way her mother avoided lingering in Erica's doorway, the extra hug her father gave her each morning that felt less like affection and more like a plea. The home had become a stage and everyone was acting, but only Erica knew the script was wrong. The weight of the unasked question grew unbearable, a pressure building behind her ribs. She could not live in the limbo of suspicion. She needed to hear the lie from their lips to see its shape, so the fracture would be clean and real. She chose a moment of apparent peace. It was late afternoon, the golden hour, when the kitchen was flooded with warm, honeyed light. Linda was at the table, sorting through a stack of coupons, her reading glasses perched on her nose. The domestic scene was so normal it ached. Erica leaned against the doorframe, the photograph from the album held loosely in her hand behind her back. Mom, Linda looked up, smiling automatically. Yes, honey. Erica stepped into the room. She placed the photograph on the table between the coupons for laundry detergent and canned soup. She didn't say anything. She just watched her mother's face. Linda's eyes dropped to the image. For a second, there was only blank confusion. Then recognition hit, and with it, a wave of pure, unadulterated panic. The color drained from her face so completely she looked grey. Her hand flew to her throat, fingers clutching at the gold chain she always wore. The reading glasses slipped from her nose and clattered onto the table. Where did you get this? Her voice was a thin whisper stripped of all warmth. The attic, Erica said, her own voice surprisingly steady. In the trunk, the one with the boring tax returns. She let the irony hang heavy and sharp. Who is the baby, Mom? The date says April. My birthday is in November. Linda's gaze was darting, trapped from the photo to Erica's face to the doorway, anywhere but the truth. Her breath came in short, shallow pulls. That's nothing. That's just an old picture. It's you and Dad, Erica stated flatly. You're holding a baby, who is it? It was a cousin's child. The words tumbled out, rushed and brittle. My cousin Bethany from Ohio. She was going through a very difficult time. Postpartum. We took the baby for a little while to help out, just for a few weeks. Linda reached out and flipped the photograph over, as if hiding its face could hide the truth. Her hands were trembling violently. The flimsiness of the story was an insult. A few weeks, in April, and you're looking at it like that. Erica's composure began to crack, a fissure of anger showing through. And the hospital bracelet in the same box, for baby girl Santos, named Erica, was that cousin Bethany's baby too? Did she just happen to name her Erica? Linda flinched as if struck. She pushed back from the table, the chair legs screeching against the floor. Erica, please, it's ancient history. It was a sad, complicated time. It doesn't matter now. She began busily gathering the scattered coupons, her movements frantic and uncoordinated. We should start dinner. Your father will be home soon. He'll want pot roast. It was a breathtaking, clumsy pivot. A story about a struggling cousin invented in a heartbeat, then an immediate retreat into the mundane armor of pot roast. Erica stood perfectly still, watching the performance. She saw not a mother protecting a painful secret, but a terrified woman constructing a dam out of tissue paper against a flood. The lie was not clever or convincing. It was desperate, a child's fabrication told with an adult's fear in her eyes. In that moment, something fundamental and immutable broke inside Erica. It was not a loud shatter, but a silent, crystalline snap, the sound of trust fracturing. The unshakable faith that her parents' words were synonymous with truth, a foundation she had walked upon for 20 years without ever thinking to test its strength, gave way. She had caught them, not in a minor fib about a broken vase or a missed curfew, but in a profound, life-sized deception. And the lie they told was so pathetically weak it revealed everything. The truth was too big, too terrible to speak. Right, Erica said, her voice hollow, a dead thing. Pot roast. She turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving the photograph face down on the table. She didn't go to her room. She walked out the front door onto the porch and sat on the top step. The evening air was warm, thick with the scent of cut grass and blooming lilacs. The neighborhood was settling into its evening. Rhythm, a sprinkler hissing, a distant dog barking, the murmur of television through a screen window. It all looked the same, but it was. The world had been recast. Her mother's panicked eyes, the invented cousin, the frantic change of subject. These were now the primary colors of her reality. The trust was not bent, it was broken. A hairline crack had become a chasm. She had come to them with evidence, seeking an explanation, and had been handed a fairy tale so fragile it dissolved at a touch. The love was still there, a vast and complicated ache in her chest, but it was now separate from trust. They loved her, she had no doubt of that, but they also feared her knowing, and they would lie to her face to keep her in the dark. Sitting on the steps as the golden light deepened into twilight, Erica felt a profound loneliness, colder and more vast than any she had ever known. She was alone with a truth her parents were too scared to tell. The investigation was no longer a search for answers hidden in attics or online databases. It was a solitary journey she would now have to make, because the first and most important source, the people who had raised her, had just failed the simplest test of honesty. The fracture was clean, and it was final. She wrapped her arms around her knees, staring at the fireflies beginning to blink in the gathering dark, a girl on the porch of a house that was no longer simply a home, but the site of a crime she had yet to fully understand. The first lie had been told, and in its wake everything was suspect. The porch light was a buzzing halo of insects, but Erica remained in the dark on the steps, the chill of the evening seeping into her bones long after the sun had vanished. The first lie had carved out a new space inside her, a hollowed chamber where trust used to be. It was now filled with a cold, relentless purpose. She could not unsee her mother's panic, could not unhear the flimsy story. The attic trunk was no longer a curiosity. It was a crime scene, and she was the sole detective. If her parents would not provide the truth, she would excavate it herself, piece by digital piece. She waited until the house was silent. The familiar creak of her parents' bedroom floorboards stilled, the soft rumble of her father's snare drum snore drifting down the hall. Then, in the blue glow of her laptop screen, she began in earnest. The earlier tentative searches had been the fumbling of a girl hoping to be proven wrong. This was different. This was systematic, clinical. She opened a fresh document and created 2 columns, known facts and questions. In known facts she typed, Hospital bracelet, baby girl Santos Erica, Dob April 10, City redacted General NJ, Photo, Mark and Linda holding infant, dated April 12, Official BC Erica Lynn Adams, Dob November 17, Philadelphia PA, discrepancy 7 months 5 days, parental behavior, evasive, fearful, demonstrably dishonest. The list was terrifying in its brevity. Questions filled faster. Who were Carlos and Maria Santos? Assumed names from bracelet format. What connection did they have to Mark and Linda? What happened in the 7-month gap? Why the secrecy? The bracelet was her only solid lead. The name Santos was a door. She needed to find the key to unlock it. She started with the obvious, online newspaper archives. Her university login granted her access to several historical databases. She navigated to one, her fingers cold on the keys. She entered Santos and the New Jersey city, narrowing the date range to a 5-year period centered on the year from the bracelet. The initial results were a deluge of irrelevance, sports scores mentioning a Santos, business listings, wedding announcements. She refined the search, adding fatal accident and car crash to the parameters, a morbid but logical hunch. If something had happened to the Santoses, it might explain a baby being with her parents. The search wheel spun, and then there it was. A single entry, a brief entry from the digital edition of the Courier, the local paper for that New Jersey city. The headline was small, buried on what would have been page B7, local couple perishes in late-night collision. The date of the article was April 28, 18 days after the date on the bracelet, 16 days after the photo. Erica's heart hammered against her sternum. She clicked the link. The article loaded, a scan of old newsprint, the text slightly blurred but legible. Carlos and Maria Santos, both 28 of 214 Maple Lane, were pronounced dead at the scene of a 2-vehicle collision on Route 9 late last night, authorities confirmed. Police report that the Santos vehicle was struck by a commercial van that allegedly ran a red light at the intersection of Route 9 and Spruce Avenue. The driver of the van, identified as Frank R. Dobbs, 54, was treated for minor injuries and released. The incident remains under investigation. The Santos family has been notified. No information on survivors was immediately available. The text was dry, bureaucratic, the kind of tragic footnote that filled local papers. But to Erica, each word was a seismic shock. Carlos and Maria Santos, 28 years old. The date of their deaths was just over 2 weeks after the date her parents were photographed holding a baby named Erica Santos. She read the article 5 times, memorizing the sparse details. 214 Maple Lane, a commercial van, Frank R. Dobbs. The cold, factual language offered no comfort, no context, only a brutal confirmation of an ending. Her eyes lingered on no information on survivors was immediately available. But there had been a survivor, a 4-month-old survivor. The room seemed to tilt. She had found a truth, but it was a truth of absence, of loss. Carlos and Maria Santos were not vague figures in a hidden story. They were real people who had lived at a real address and had died on a real road. And in the wake of that reality, the photograph of her parents took on a new, devastating meaning. It was not a picture of a mysterious, joyful event. It was a picture taken in the shadow of a tragedy. The awe and tenderness on their faces were now tinged with a grief she had not recognized before. They were holding an orphan. Erica minimized the browser window, the article's ghostly image lingering behind her eyelids. She opened a map and typed in 214 Maple Lane, followed by the city name. Street view loaded, showing a modest, well-kept bungalow with a green roof and a flower bed under the front window. It looked like a home. Her first home. She zoomed in, her cursor hovering over the door, a profound and useless longing aching in her chest. This digital street, this pixelated house, was a place she would never remember, a life that had been erased. The discovery was not a relief, it was a weight. The lie had a shape now, and it was the shape of a headstone. The 7-month discrepancy began to make a horrible logistical sense. Time for legal procedures. Time for a closed adoption to be arranged. Time for a new birth certificate to be issued, creating Erica Adams from the ashes of Erica Santos. She leaned back in her chair, the laptop's fan whirring softly in the silent room. The digital digging had yielded a core fact, but it had only deepened the mystery. Who were Carlos and Maria beyond names in a police blotter? What were they like? Why were they her parents' closest friends? The article was a full stop, but her story demanded a beginning and a middle. She had the what and the when. The why and the who remained locked away, not in databases, but in the memories of the two people sleeping down the hall, people who had just proven they would guard those memories with desperate lies. Erica closed the laptop, plunging the room into darkness save for the streetlight's glow through the blinds. She sat for a long time, the names Carlos and Maria Santos echoing in the quiet. They were no longer just names on a bracelet. They were a ghostly couple in a car on a late-night road, their story ending abruptly, leaving a baby behind. And she was that baby. The digital trail ended here at the edge of a cliff. The next step would not be through a screen. It would require facing the physical evidence of that ending, to stand on the actual ground where the story had shattered. The cold purpose inside her solidified into a plan. She needed to see their grave. The printed article from the Courier felt like a lead weight in the pocket of Erica's jeans. The drive to the New Jersey city was a 2-hour blur of highway hypnosis, the landscape flattening, and then thickening into suburbs she did not recognize. She had told her parents she was spending the day with a friend from high school, a lie that came to her lips with a disturbing ease. The deception felt necessary, a protective shell around her fragile burgeoning mission. She needed proof that was not pixels on a screen, but stone in the earth. She needed to stand on the ground where the story ended, to feel its reality in the air she breathed. The cemetery, Oak Haven Memorial Gardens, was on the outskirts of the city, a sprawling field of quietude bordered by a low stone wall. The morning was overcast, a flat pearl-grey sky pressing down on the manicured lawns and orderly rows of markers. The air was still and carried the damp, green scent of recent rain on cut grass. Erica parked her car on the gravel lane, the sound of the engine cutting off leaving a silence so profound it rang in her ears. She sat for a moment, clutching the steering wheel, the printed directions to the Santos plot trembling in her hand. The article had listed the cemetery. A follow-up search of its online burial records, a morbid but efficient task, had given her the section and plot numbers. She stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched loudly under her sneakers, an obscene noise in the holy quiet. She followed the map past sections with names like Serenity Slope and Whispering Pines, the path winding between monuments of varying grandeur, tall obelisks, simple flat stones, the occasional angel with weathered wings. The place was a map of endings, and she was searching for the one that had precipitated her beginning. Section E, row 12. The markers here were simpler, older. She walked slowly, her eyes scanning the names, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. And then she saw them. 2 identical pale grey granite headstones, side by side, their surfaces speckled with lichen and time. They were modest, unadorned save for carved crosses at the top. The left stone read, Carlos Santos, beloved husband and son, 1973-2001. The right, Maria Elena Santos, beloved wife and daughter, 1973-2001. The same year, the same terrible year from the article. The dates of birth made them 28. The dates of death were exactly as printed, April 27, 2001, 17 days after the birth date on the hospital bracelet, 16 days after the photograph. A sound escaped Erica's lips, a small, punched-out exhale that was not quite a sob. The abstract had become concrete. The digital fact was now physical, geological. Here was the earth that covered Carlos and Maria Santos. Here was the proof that they were not a story, not a possibility, but people who had lived and died. Their lives ending just as hers in their care was truly beginning. The discrepancy in the dates, the 7-month gap, snapped into a horrifying logical sequence. The accident, the aftermath, the transition, the adoption finalized by November, her legs gave way. She didn't so much sit as fold onto the damp grass between the two graves, the moisture immediately seeping through the knees of her jeans. She reached out, her fingers tracing the carved letters of Maria's name. The stone was cold and rough, real in a way nothing else had been. This woman had carried her. This man had been her father. They had chosen the name Erica. They had brought her home to 214 Maple Lane. They had loved her for 4 months. And then they were gone, leaving only this patch of grass, these 2 stones, and a baby who remembered nothing. A terrifying, profound connection ignited within her, a live wire of grief for a loss she could not recall. It was not the familiar, aching love she felt for Mark and Linda. This was ancestral, a primal pull from the very soil. She was made from these people. Her dark hair perhaps was from Maria. Her smile, maybe, was an echo of Carlos's easy grin in the attic photographs. She was their biological echo, sitting alone at the epicenter of their silence. Tears came then, hot and silent, streaking down her face and dripping onto the grass. She cried for the couple in the ground, for the life they never got to live, for the daughter they never got to watch grow up. She cried for the baby in the photograph, oblivious in her parents' arms, soon to be stripped of her name and her history. And she cried for herself, for the 20-year-old girl who had just discovered that the bedrock of her identity was a salvage operation, a lifeboat launched from a shipwreck. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of a nearby oak, a sound like a gentle sigh. Erica looked from one headstone to the other, imagining them here together as they were in life and now in death. A profound loneliness, deeper and older than the one she felt on her porch steps, enveloped her. She had spent 2 decades surrounded by love, yet at this moment, she felt like the last person on earth who carried the specific, cellular memory of Carlos and Maria Santos. She was their living monument, and she hadn't even known it. She didn't know how long she sat there, the grey sky holding her in its diffuse light. The initial storm of grief settled into a heavy, aching certainty. The questions were not answered, but the central, horrible truth was now undeniable. She had a past that predated Mark and Linda. It was buried here, under 6 feet of New Jersey soil. The love she had grown up with was real, but it was a love that had begun in tragedy and been built upon a secret. The confrontation she had been circling was now inevitable. She could not unsee these graves. She could not unknow this connection. The evidence was no longer a photograph or a bracelet or a newspaper article. It was carved in stone, and it was calling her name. With stiff, cold limbs, Erica pushed herself to her feet. Her jeans were stained dark with damp. She looked at the 2 headstones one last time, a silent, wordless apology and a promise forming in her heart. Then she turned and walked back along the gravel path, the weight of the truth now a permanent part of her. And final, she did not shout, she did not weep. She let the question hang in the still, fragrant air of the kitchen, a verdict and a demand. Who am I? Mark and Linda looked at each other. It was a glance that spanned decades. A silent, desperate communication forged in hospital corridors and lawyers' offices, in whispered conversations after she was asleep, in a shared, terrible love and a shared, consuming fear. It was a look of absolute despair, of a long-dreaded script they now had no choice but to perform. The day they had feared for 2 decades, the day they had postponed with birthdays and holidays and the sheer force of their hope, had arrived not with a knock, but with the quiet, terrible slam of truth laid bare on their kitchen table. The performance was over. The lie finally had nowhere left to hide. The silence after her question was a physical presence, thick and suffocating, broken only by the frantic hiss of boiling water overflowing onto the stove. Linda moved automatically, a marionette of habit, turning off the burner. The act was absurdly mundane, a tiny anchor in the cataclysm. She did not return to the table. She stood with her back to them, her shoulders shaking, her hands gripping the edge of the countertop as if it were a lifeline. Mark remained seated, his broad frame seeming to shrink into itself, his eyes fixed on the artifacts of the past Erica had arrayed before him. He looked ancient, hollowed out. Erica did not repeat her question. She waited, the cold clarity that had carried her from the cemetery hardening into a patient, unyielding stillness. She would wait all night. She would wait forever. It was Linda who broke, her resolve crumbling under the weight of that silent demand. She turned slowly, her face ravaged by tears that carved shiny tracks through her pallor. She looked at Mark, a wordless plea for strength, and he gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. The burden of the story, it seemed, was hers to begin. She walked to the table on unsteady legs and pulled out a chair, sinking into it as if her bones had dissolved. She did not look at Erica, but at the photograph of herself holding the baby. Carlos and Maria, she began, her voice a frayed whisper, cracking on the second name. She cleared her throat, but it did not steady. They were our closest friends, our family. A sob escaped, harsh and sudden, and she pressed a fist to her mouth, compressing it. She took a shuddering breath. Carlos worked with your father. They started at the firm the same week. Maria, she was light. She was laughter. We met them for dinner one Friday, and by Sunday it felt like we'd known them our whole lives. She reached out a trembling finger and touched the edge of the photograph, tracing the blurry outline of the baby's blanket. You were their world, their miracle. Maria had trouble conceiving too. When you were born, Linda's eyes finally lifted to meet Erica's, and the love in them was so raw, so anguished, it was almost unbearable. You were so loved. From the very first second, we were all there, we celebrated, you were our collective joy. The past tense hung heavily. Linda's gaze dropped back to the newspaper article. The accident, it was a Tuesday. They were coming home from a movie. A date night, we were babysitting. Her voice dropped to a haunted monotone. The police called our house because we were the emergency contacts. We had to go to identify. She couldn't finish. Mark reached across the table, his large hand covering her shaking one, his own eyes glistening. He took up the narrative, his voice gravelly with suppressed emotion. There was no one else. Maria's parents were gone. Carlos's family was in Portugal, elderly, unable to travel or care for an infant. Social services was involved. It was chaos. Grief and this tiny, perfect baby who needed everything. He looked at Erica, his expression one of profound apology. You were 4 months old. You had just started to smile at us. You knew our faces. In all that horror, you were the only thing that made sense. Linda found her voice again, pulling her hand from under Mark's to wrap her arms around herself. We were already your guardians in their wills. A formality, they'd said. A just in case. We never imagined, but it made the process slightly less impossible. We brought you home. Here, you'd been here so often it was familiar. You had your own crib in the guest room. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, vanished. At first it was temporary, foster care while the legalities were sorted. But we couldn't let you go to strangers. And we had wanted a child for so long. The tests, the treatments, the heartbreak. It felt like a cruel, terrible miracle. We became your permanent legal guardians, Mark continued, his words measured, as if reciting a painful testimony. Then, after a year, the adoption was finalized, closed. It was what the lawyer advised, what the child's psychologist recommended, a clean start, to protect you from the trauma of the story, to let you have a normal life with parents who adored you without the shadow of that loss. We were going to tell you, Linda whispered, the words a desperate plea for understanding. We swore to each other we would, when you were old enough, 18. We had a speech planned, but then you were 18 and you were so happy applying to colleges and the thought of shattering your world. She shook her head, fresh tears falling. We were cowards, we kept postponing. After graduation, we said, when she's more settled. Every year the lie felt heavier and the truth felt more impossible to say. We were so afraid of seeing the look on your face that we are seeing now. We were afraid you would hate us, that you would leave and never come back. Her confession spilled out, not as justification, but as a stark, unvarnished accounting of fear and love twisted together over 2 decades. They described the agony of packing away the Santos belongings, of selecting only a few precious, pain-filled mementos to preserve in the trunk. Not to hide, Linda insisted through her tears, but to keep safe for her, for when she was ready. They described the surreal process of obtaining a new birth certificate, of watching the name Adams officially replace Santos, a bureaucratic erasure that felt both like a salvation and a betrayal. They spoke of the phantom grief that haunted their own joy, the guilt that tinged every birthday celebration, the way they would look at her sometimes and see Maria's eyes or Carlos's smile, a bittersweet reminder of the friends they had lost and the daughter they had gained. Erica listened, motionless. The glacial fury within her began to fissure, not melting, but cracking under the torrent of their pain. This was not the simple, malicious deception she had imagined in her rage. It was a tragedy, followed by a choice, followed by a long, slow accumulation of fear. She saw the ghosts in the room now, not just Carlos and Maria, but the ghosts of the people Mark and Linda might have been had that Tuesday night never happened, the ghost of the child they might have had biologically, the ghost of the straightforward parenthood they had been denied, and her own ghost, Erica Santos, a baby who vanished into paperwork and was reborn as Erica Adams. The story unfolded, halting and raw, until there were no more words, only the heavy, tear-soaked silence of a truth finally exposed. The evidence on the table was no longer accusatory. It was simply proof. Proof of a life violently interrupted, and of another life, her life, built lovingly and fearfully in its wake. The foundation of her existence had not been a lie, she realized with a dizzying shift in perspective. It had been a salvage, a rescue mission conducted by two grieving people who had loved her first as their friend's child, and then completely and irrevocably as their own. The kitchen, the heart of her home, was now a confessional, and the air was thick with the incense of shattered secrets and unconditional, imperfect love. Mark's voice, when it came, was a low, steady river carving through the silence left by Linda's tears. He looked not at the evidence on the table, but at Erica, his gaze holding a lifetime of deferred explanations. "A closed adoption," he began, the words sounding formal, rehearsed in the quiet of his mind 1,000 times. "That's what they called it. The lawyer, the social worker, they all said it was the cleanest way. For you." He paused, his throat working. "The idea was to protect you, to let you grow up as Erica Adams with a clear story, a solid identity without the weight of a tragedy you were too young to understand or carry." He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his large hands clasped tightly. "It wasn't about erasing them, Erica. Never that. How could we? Carlos was the brother I never had. Maria was Linda's other half. They're in every good memory of our 20s. But you were a baby. Your world was supposed to be safe and simple. We were told that introducing a story of profound loss of other parents could confuse your sense of self, of belonging. We were told a clean start was a gift." A bitter, helpless smile touched his lips. "We believed it because we wanted to, and because we were terrified. We had you, this beautiful, smiling baby who had already lost so much. The thought of causing you more pain, of making your world unstable, it was unthinkable. So we followed the script. We packed away the photos, the letters, the little shoes. We locked them up, not to hide them from you forever, but to keep them safe for you. For when you were ready, we told ourselves we were building a fortress of normalcy around you." Linda, her face blotchy and exhausted, nodded, her eyes fixed on her own twisting hands. "We set a date," she whispered. "Your 18th birthday. We had it circled in our minds for years. We'd give you the trunk, we'd explain everything. We practiced what we'd say." She shook her head, a fresh tear tracing the line of her jaw. "But then you turned 18 and you were so happy. You'd just gotten your acceptance to college. You were planning your future so bright and sure. And we looked at each other and thought, how can we drop this on her now? How can we fracture this? So we said, after high school graduation. Then it was after her first semester when she settled. Then, maybe after college." Her voice broke. "It was cowardice, pure and simple. Every day we didn't tell you, the lie grew roots. It wasn't a lie of malice, sweetheart. It was a lie of preservation. We were so afraid the truth would change how you looked at us, that you'd see us not as your parents, but as caretakers, as imposters who stole you from a ghost story. We were afraid you'd grieve for them, and in that grief you'd leave us behind. The love we had for you, it was so big it made us terrified of losing you. So we kept postponing the truth until the truth became this monster in the attic we could no longer control." Erica listened, absorbing their words not as a child, but as a judge weighing a complex, heartbreaking case. The cold, sharp fury that had propelled her home from the cemetery was dissolving, not into forgiveness, but into a vast, bewildering landscape of conflicting emotions. She felt them all at once, a turbulent weather system inside her chest. First, a profound, aching grief, not the abstract sadness from the cemetery, but a specific, personal mourning for Carlos and Maria Santos. For the father whose laugh lines she would never see deepen, for the mother whose voice she would never hear. For the birthday cards never signed, the advice never given, the pride in her achievements never expressed. They were no longer just names on a headstone, they were the phantom limbs of her history, and their absence throbbed with a sudden, visceral pain. Simultaneously, a hot coil of anger tightened around her heart, anger at the lie. Not just the initial secrecy, but the 20 years of conscious omission. The birthdays where they toasted to our family, the family tree projects she'd done in school using their fabricated lineage, the simple questions about her eyes or her smile that were met with vague, deflecting answers. They had denied her the right to her own origin. They had made her a stranger to herself. The anger was clean and sharp, a blade of betrayal. And swirling through it all, a dizzying, profound confusion about her own identity. Who was she? Erica Adams, the beloved only child of Mark and Linda, a girl with a predictable suburban history. Or Erica Santos, the orphaned daughter of artists, a girl born from love and tragedy, her roots severed and grafted onto another tree. She looked at her hands, were they her hands or Maria's? Her reflection in the dark window of the kitchen seemed suddenly unfamiliar, a face that belonged to two stories, two sets of parents, two names. The solid I at the center of her being had liquefied. She was a puzzle assembled from two different boxes, and the picture on the lid had just been revealed as a counterfeit. She looked at Mark and Linda, their faces etched with fear and love and a desperate hope for absolution. They were the architects of her world, and they had built it on a fault line they themselves had created. The love she felt for them was real, a deep cellular loyalty, but it now existed alongside the grief for the parents she never knew and the anger for the truth withheld. These emotions did not cancel each other out. They coexisted, a tangled, painful knot in the center of her soul. "I need," Erica started, her own voice sounding foreign, hoarse from disuse. "I need to be alone." It was not a rejection but a necessity. The kitchen, with its warm light and the ghosts of 1,000 family meals, could not contain the seismic shift happening within her. She needed space where the echoes of Santos and Adams weren't bouncing off the familiar walls. She pushed back her chair, the legs scraping against the floor, a sound that made both her parents flinch. She did not look at them as she walked out of the room. She climbed the stairs, each step heavy, and closed the door to her bedroom. For a long time, she simply stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by the artifacts of Erica Adams, the trophies, the posters, the stuffed animals from childhood. It all looked like a museum exhibit of a person she was no longer sure she knew. The grief, the anger, the confusion swirled, a silent storm. She was an orphan and a cherished daughter. She was the product of a terrible loss and a profound gain. She was Erica, whoever that was now. The story had unfolded, raw and complete, and in its wake she was left standing in the rubble of her own identity, tasked with the impossible work of rebuilding a self she no longer recognized. The confrontation was over. The much harder work of comprehension had just begun. The house did not feel like a home. It felt like a museum after hours, a diorama of a life that was now under glass, observed but not inhabited. The familiar creaks of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, all were amplified in the heavy silence that had settled after Erica's retreat upstairs. It was a silence woven through with quiet tears and the ghost of unspoken words, a thick, palpable thing that filled the rooms and made the air difficult to breathe. Downstairs, Mark and Linda moved through the aftermath like survivors of a storm, speaking in hushed, fragmented sentences. The pot of ruined food was discarded, the table wiped clean of the physical evidence, though its imprint seemed seared into the wood. They did not turn on the television. They did not turn on music. They sat in the living room, not touching, each lost in the private wreckage of their shared guilt, listening for any sound from above. The confession had been a release, a lancing of a festering wound, but the relief was overshadowed by the terrifying uncertainty of what came next. They had handed their daughter a grenade of truth and could only wait in the blast radius. Upstairs, Erica sat on the edge of her bed, her body humming with a static energy that had no outlet. The storm of emotions, the grief, the anger, the profound dislocation, had not subsided. They had simply settled into a cold, numb weight. She felt untethered, as if the gravitational pull of her own life had suddenly ceased. The room, her sanctuary since childhood, now felt like a stranger's. The soccer trophies on the shelf, the faded movie posters, the quilt her grandmother had stitched, they all belonged to Erica Adams. But who was she? The question echoed in the hollow space the confrontation had carved inside her. She needed space, not just from her parents, but from the suffocating narrative of this house. She stood and walked to the bookshelf, her fingers trailing over the spines of childhood favorites. Her gaze landed not on the books, but on the framed photographs clustered there. She picked one up. It was a professional portrait from her high school graduation, the three of them beaming, her cap's tassel swung to the side. She looked at her parents' faces, the pride, the joy. She had always seen only that. Now she saw the guardians. She saw the keepers of a secret, their smiles tinged with a fear she now understood. In another photo, a candid shot from a beach vacation, she saw Mark hoisting a 10-year-old Erica onto his shoulders. She saw not just a father's playful strength, but a man desperately building memories to outshine a hidden past. In a picture of Linda teaching her to bake cookies, she saw a mother's tenderness, and also a woman perhaps overcompensating, pouring all her nurturing into a child that was, in the most technical sense, not hers. Every image was now a palimpsest. The surface story of a happy family was still there, real and true in its own way. But beneath it, visible only to her newly adjusted eyes, was the shadow story. Two grieving friends, a tragic accident, a rescued baby, a lifetime of careful curation. The love in the pictures was not diminished, but it was complicated, layered with a foundation of loss and fear. She was not just their daughter. She was their most profound responsibility, their greatest joy and their deepest shame. The photos did not provide answers, they only deepened the labyrinth. The numbness began to crack under a rising tide of loneliness, so acute it was a physical ache. She needed a voice from outside the echo chamber of this house, a tether to a reality that was not fundamentally altered. She grabbed her phone and scrolled to her best friend's name, Chloe. They had shared everything since the 7th grade. Homework crises, first heartbreaks, stupid jokes, big dreams. Chloe knew the Erica Adams who complained about her parents being too nosy, who rolled her eyes at their corny traditions. She did not know the first thing about Erica Santos. The phone rang only once before Chloe answered, her voice bright and familiar. "Hey, stranger, I was just about to text you. Guess who I ran into at the mall?" Erica opened her mouth but no sound came out. The simple, sunny normalcy in Chloe's voice was a universe away. A choked sob erupted from her throat, harsh and sudden. "Erica," Chloe's tone shifted instantly to concern. "Erica, what's wrong? What happened?" The dam broke. The tears came in a hot, uncontrollable flood, and with them words tumbled out in ragged, broken pieces. "They're not my parents. I found out there was an accident, my real parents." She tried to articulate the truth, but it was like describing an earthquake while still standing on the shaking ground. She stammered about the attic, the bracelet, the grave, the confession. The sentences were incomplete, the chronology a jumble. She was not telling a story, she was vomiting up fragments of a shattered world. Whoa, slow down, breathe." Chloe's voice was calm and anchor. "Just breathe, I'm here, I'm listening." Erica sucked in a shuddering breath, trying to assemble the pieces into something coherent. "My parents, Mark and Linda, they adopted me. My biological parents, their best friends, died in a car crash when I was a baby. They never told me. My whole life it's based on a lie." The word lie felt both accurate and inadequate, failing to capture the tragic complexity, but it was the only one she had. There was a long silence on the other end, followed by a soft, "Oh my God, Erica, oh my God." Then, with fierce loyalty, "Are you safe? Do you need me to come over?" "No, I'm safe, I don't know who I am." The confession to Chloe made it more real, more horrifying. "My name was different. My birthday might be different. Everything I thought was my history, it's not mine. I'm looking at my own face and I don't recognize it. Who am I supposed to be now?" She struggled to articulate the vertigo of her new identity. Was she the sum of the genes of two people she would never meet? Was she the product of the love and values of the two people who raised her? Was she some unstable compound of both, forever divided? She had no vocabulary for this. There was no word for a person who was both orphaned and abundantly parented, for a grief that was both profound and abstract, for a betrayal that was born from love. She was an equation with variables that had been hidden from her, and now she was supposed to solve for X, for her own self, with no instructions. Chloe listened, interjecting with soft, affirming sounds, asking gentle questions that helped Erica string the fragments into a narrative. Just speaking it aloud to someone who knew only the before version of her life was both cathartic and deeply isolating. She was introducing a stranger to Chloe, and that stranger was herself. After a long time, the tears subsided into hiccuping breaths. Exhaustion pressed down on her, heavy as stone. "I don't know what to do," Erica whispered. "You don't have to know right now," Chloe said, her voice firm and kind. "You just found out. Your job right now is to feel whatever you're feeling. It's all valid. The anger, the sadness, the confusion, all of it. And I'm right here, whatever you need." They talked a while longer, until the raw edge of the panic had dulled to a throbbing ache. Hanging up, Erica felt marginally less alone, but the core question remained, echoing in the new, hollow chambers of her heart. The house below was still silent, holding its breath. The photos on the shelf still told their dual-layered stories. She had recounted the truth, but she was no closer to articulating who she was now. She was a story with two beginnings and one muddled middle, and she was the author who had just been handed a pen, expected to write an ending for a tale she was only beginning to comprehend. The aftermath was not an end. It was a vast, empty plain, and she was standing in the center of it, utterly alone, with no map and a compass that spun wildly, pointing in all directions at once. The fragile truce that settled over the house was built on a foundation of exhaustion and raw honesty. Words were sparse, but the air was clearer. The oppressive fog of the secret finally dissipated. Mark and Linda moved with a tentative care, as if the very floors might give way under the weight of their revealed history. Erica moved through the rooms with a new, quiet purpose. The initial shock had crystallized into a need, a deep, cellular pull toward the shadows that had now been named. She could not rebuild her sense of self on the story of the accident alone. She needed to know who Carlos and Maria Santos had been in life, not just in death. She needed color, texture, sound, anything to flesh out the ghosts. A week after the confrontation, she found her parents in the living room, sitting in their usual chairs but not reading, simply existing in the uneasy quiet. Erica stood in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I want to know more," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "About them, not just how they died, how they lived." Linda looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and understanding. Mark set down the newspaper he hadn't been reading. "What do you want to know?" he asked gently. "Everything you can tell me, and I want to see if there's anything else, anything they left for me." She saw the flicker of pain in their eyes, the fear that seeking her roots meant uprooting herself from them completely. She added softly, "It doesn't mean I love you less. It means I need to understand where I came from, to know who I am now." It was a hesitant blessing they gave, laced with anxiety but ultimately resigned to the necessity of her quest. Linda provided the name of the lawyer who had handled the guardianship and subsequent adoption all those years ago, Arthur Brigham. He was retired now, Linda explained, but still lived in the area. She wrote his number on a slip of paper, her handwriting shaky. "He was a good man, very discreet. He helped us through everything. He might have kept some things." The call to Arthur Brigham was one of the most surreal experiences of Erica's life. She introduced herself as Erica Adams, formerly Santos. There was a long pause on the line, a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "I wondered when this day would come," the old man's voice crackled, weary but not unkind. "Your parents, Mark and Linda, they loved you very much. They were operating from a place of profound fear, but it was love that fueled it." He agreed to see her. His office in a quiet, wood-paneled suite in a building that smelled of old books and lemon oil was a time capsule. He was a man in his 70s, with kind eyes behind thick glasses and a deliberate slowness to his movements. He listened as Erica explained what she had discovered and what she sought. He nodded slowly, as if confirming a story he already knew by heart. "Carlos and Maria were remarkable people," Brigham said, leaning back in his leather chair. "I didn't know them well socially, but in our meetings, drawing up the wills, the guardianship papers, their love for each other and for you was palpable. They were planners, practical but full of life. They wanted everything in order, not out of pessimism, but so they could enjoy the life they were building without worry." He sighed, the cruel irony. He stood with some effort and walked to an old, green filing cabinet in the corner. He sorted through a drawer, his fingers moving with practiced ease despite his age. When the accident happened and Mark and Linda began the adoption process, certain personal effects of your biological parents were placed in my care. Items not relevant to the estate, but too personal to discard. The intention was always that they would be passed to you at the appropriate time. He pulled out a slim, legal-sized envelope and a small, wrapped bundle. "Mark and Linda were too grief-stricken to deal with them at the time. They asked me to hold these. I believe the appropriate time has arrived." He handed her the envelope first. It was not sealed. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. The paper was heavy, a creamy stationery, now slightly yellowed at the edges. The writing was in dark blue ink, a masculine looping script that flowed across the page. "My dearest Maria, the light is fading outside my studio window, and all I can think about is the light you bring with you when you walk into a room. I'm supposed to be sketching concepts for the Miller mural, but my pencil keeps tracing the curve of your smile instead. This happens more and more. You have become my favorite subject, my most constant muse. I picked up the rattle today, the silver one with the little bells that sound like your laugh. I held it and tried to imagine the tiny hand that will one day shake it. Our child. The thought is a physical ache of joy in my chest. We will fill a house with light and color and music, and this little one will be our greatest collaboration. I already love this person we haven't met with a ferocity that frightens me. Come home soon. The apartment is too quiet without you. All my love forever." Carlos. Erica read the letter twice, 3 times. The words seemed to vibrate in her hands. This was not a document of death, but a testament of life, of anticipation, of artistic passion and deep, abiding love. Our greatest collaboration. She could see him, a young artist in a sunlit studio, thinking of his wife, dreaming of their future. The love letter was a window into a world that was vibrant and whole, a world that existed before the screech of tires on a late-night road. It made the tragedy feel fresh, more devastating, but it also gave Carlos a voice. He was not just a name on a headstone, He was a man who sketched murals and wrote love letters. Tears blurred the elegant script. She carefully refolded the letter, her touch reverent, and turned to the small bundle. Unwrapping the soft tissue paper, she revealed a tiny silver rattle. It was tarnished with age but delicately made, with a smooth handle and a bulbous end filigreed with swirling patterns. Tiny bells were enclosed within. She turned it over. On the bottom in minute, elegant engraving were the initials E.S. Erica Santos. Her fingers closed gently around the cool metal. She gave it a soft shake. A faint, high musical jingle emerged, a ghost of a sound, like the echo of the laugh Carlos had written about. This was an object she had held as an infant. This was a sound that had once captivated her. It was a tangible thread connecting her to the baby in the photograph, to the parents who had chosen it for her. They were artists, Brigham said softly, watching her. Carlos was a muralist and graphic designer. Maria was a potter. Their home, from what I understand, was filled with their work, bold colors, interesting shapes. They lived with intention and joy. It was a terrible loss for the world and for you. Erica clutched the rattle and the letter to her chest, a bittersweet ache blooming under her ribs, so profound it was almost beautiful. She felt a connection, not the terrifying, gravitational pull from the cemetery, but something warmer, more nuanced. She felt the echo of their creativity, their passion, their hope. She saw where her own love of color, her tendency to lose herself in sketching in the margins of her notebooks, might have originated. It was a heritage, not just a history. She thanked Arthur Brigham, her voice thick with emotion. Driving home, the silver rattle sat on the passenger seat, catching the afternoon sun. The love letter was safely in her bag. She felt a strange sense of possession, not of objects, but of fragments of a story. She had sought roots in the dry soil of documents and grave, and had been given a living, breathing glimpse of the tree that had been felled. The connection was bittersweet, a joy laced with the acute pain of what had been lost, but it was real. Carlos and Maria Santos were no longer just victims of a tragedy. They were a young, talented, deeply in love couple who had eagerly awaited her arrival. She was their greatest collaboration, and in that she found a new piece of herself. Not just a survivor of a loss, but a product of a great and hopeful love. The roots she sought were not dead. They were dormant, and in holding these precious, fragile effects, she felt the first faint, painful stir of something green and growing deep within the fractured soil of her identity. The house on Maple Drive could no longer contain the new, fragile reality. Its walls, which had held the secret for so long, now seemed to press in on the three people navigating its aftermath. The air was thick with things both said and unsaid, the confession, the tears, the raw exposition of a hidden history. A tense, careful politeness had replaced the easy familiarity of before. It was the silence after the earthquake, when every aftershock is felt with heightened dread. Erica knew she could not heal, could not even begin to think, within the museum of her old life. The artifacts of Erica Adams, the trophies, the yearbooks, the quilt on the bed, were now relics of a persona that felt like a well-crafted costume. She needed a neutral space, a blank page. She told her parents she was moving into her college apartment early. The summer lease had started. She had planned to wait until August, but now, the thought of those empty, impersonal rooms was a sanctuary. Mark and Linda received the news with a mixture of devastation and understanding. They did not protest. They helped her pack her car with a quiet, mournful efficiency, their hands brushing against hers as they passed boxes, each touch a silent plea and an apology. The apartment was a standard off-campus box, beige walls, scuffed laminate floors, a faint smell of stale popcorn and cleaning solution. Erica unpacked the essentials, clothes, laptop, a few books, and left the rest in stacked cardboard towers in the living room. The emptiness was a relief. Here there were no ghosts in the hallway, no photographs with dual meanings, no kitchen table that had witnessed the unraveling. Here she was simply a person in a room, untethered from both Maple Drive and Maple Lane. The silence was her own. The conversations with Mark and Linda did not stop. They migrated to phone calls and carefully arranged visits at a neutral coffee shop halfway between the apartment and the house. The first meeting was agonizing. They sat around a small, sticky table, mugs of cooling coffee between them like fortifications. The easy chatter of other patrons was a dissonant soundtrack to their stiffness. Erica spoke first. Her voice was low, measured. She looked at them, really looked at them, seeing the new lines of stress etched around their eyes, the grey that seemed to have multiplied in her father's hair in just weeks. "I need you to know that I believe you," she began. "I believe you loved Carlos and Maria. I believe you loved me. I believe you were trying to protect me." She took a shaky breath. But you have to understand the protection felt like a prison. Every birthday, every family story, every time I asked a simple question about where I got my eyes, it was all built on an omission. You gave me a beautiful life, but you built it on a fault line you knew was there. The love feels real. The betrayal feels real too. They exist in the same space inside me, and I don't know how to make them fit. It was the most honest thing she had ever said to them. Linda cried silent tears, nodding as if each word were a deserved blow. Mark's eyes glistened, his jaw tight with the effort of holding his own emotion in check. "We know," he said, his voice gravelly. "We have always known the risk we were taking. We told ourselves the lie was a temporary shelter, but we stayed inside it until the walls became the world. We are so sorry, Erica. Not just for the secret, but for the loneliness of you having to discover it by yourself. We failed you in that most basic way. We were not honest." These strained but honest exchanges became a new ritual. They did not resolve the pain, but they allowed it to exist in the open air, named and acknowledged. Erica expressed the deep hurt not as a weapon, but as a fact, a landscape they all had to survey. They in turn did not hide behind their good intentions anymore. They sat in the uncomfortable reality of their poor choices. It was excruciating, but it was clean. For the first time since the attic, they were all working with the same set of truths. The idea of family therapy came from Linda, voiced tentatively over the phone one evening. "We can't navigate this alone," she said. "We're all lost. Maybe someone with a map could help." Erica, surprised by her own willingness, agreed. It felt like the next logical, terrifying step. If they were to rebuild, they could not use the same blueprints that had failed so catastrophically. They needed new ones, drawn on a foundation of transparency. The therapist's office was a calm, book-lined room with comfortable chairs arranged in a loose circle. Dr. Evans was a woman in her 50s with a calm presence and eyes that held no judgment, only a focused curiosity. The first session was largely silent, filled with the weight of the unsaid. The second session, Erica found her voice. She described the attic, the cold dread, the cemetery, the crushing sense of dislocation. She talked about the love letter from Carlos, not to evoke guilt, but to illustrate the vibrant world that had been kept from her. Mark and Linda listened, and when it was their turn, they spoke not as the authorities of her life, but as fellow casualties of the same tragedy. They described their grief for their friends, their terror at the responsibility of a baby, their escalating fear of losing the daughter they had come to adore. They admitted to the cowardice, the endless postponements. In that neutral space with a guide, their story was no longer a defense or an accusation. It was a shared history of love, loss, and profound human error. It was not a magic fix. Sessions were often draining, leaving Erica emotionally spent. Some days the anger would flare, hot and bright, and she would retreat to her silent apartment for days. Other days, a wave of grief for the parents she never knew would hollow her out, and she would find herself answering Linda's gentle check-in texts with a gratitude that surprised her. The dynamic was fractured, a whole plate dropped and glued back together. The seams were visible, the shape was slightly warped, but it was holding. It could hold something again, even if it could never hold the same unquestioning trust. The rebuilding was slow, granular work. It involved setting new boundaries. Erica needed space to explore her Santos identity without feeling she was betraying the Adams family. Mark and Linda had to learn to tolerate the anxiety that came with that exploration, to resist the old, fearful urge to control the narrative. They were learning a new language, one where "I am hurt by this" could exist in the same sentence as "I still love you." The fractured whole was not a return to what was. That was gone, shattered in the attic dust. It was the fragile, deliberate assembly of something new, a relationship built not on the myth of a seamless origin, but on the acknowledged, painful, and honest rubble of the past. They were three people, standing in the wreckage, passing each other pieces and slowly, carefully, beginning to construct a different kind of shelter, one with windows that let in the difficult light of truth. It was the first tentative step on a long road, but for the first time since the trunk lid opened, they were all facing the same direction, maps in hand, ready to walk. The date on the calendar was a ghost, a day that had passed unmarked for 21 years. April 10th, the day Maria Elena Santos had become a mother. Erica had known for weeks it was coming, had felt its approach like a change in barometric pressure, a gathering quiet in her soul. She did not want to spend it in the sterile silence of her apartment or in the strained, careful atmosphere of her parents' house. She needed to go back to the source, but she did not want to go alone. The request was made over the phone, her voice quieter than she intended. "Will you come with me to the cemetery on her birthday?" There was a long pause on the other end, a held breath. Then Linda's voice, thick with emotion, simply said, "Yes." Of course, they drove to Oak Haven Memorial Gardens on a morning that held the soft, promising warmth of early spring. The sky was a pale, watercolor blue, and the trees were dusted with the faintest green haze of new buds. The silence in the car was not the tense, loaded quiet of the past months, but something more contemplative, a shared space holding a shared grief. Linda clutched a small bouquet of tulips, yellow and pink, in her lap, the cellophane wrapper crackling softly with the motion of the car. The cemetery was different in the spring light. The grass was greener, the air sweet with the scent of damp earth and early flowers. The grim, grey weight of Erica's first visit had lifted somewhat, replaced by a melancholy that felt almost peaceful. They walked the familiar path to Section E, Row 12, their footsteps in sync on the gravel. The two pale granite stones stood as they had before, but today they did not seem as cold. The lichen looked like a natural patina, not a stain of neglect. Erica stopped before Maria's grave. Linda stood beside her, close but not touching. For a long moment they simply looked at the carved name, the dates that framed a life too short. Then Linda bent and carefully laid the tulips at the base of the headstone. The bright colours looked vivid against the grey stone and the green grass, a splash of life in the field of memory. "She loved tulips," Linda said softly, straightening up. Her voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the sacred quiet. "She planted hundreds of bulbs around their bungalow every fall. Said they were the first promise of joy after winter." Erica absorbed this, a new precious detail to add to her small collection. She pictured Maria on her knees in the dirt of Maple Lane, tucking promises into the earth. "Thank you for coming with me," Erica said. "I should have come with you the first time," Linda replied, her eyes fixed on the grave. "I was just so afraid." "I know." They lapsed into silence again, but it was a comfortable one, filled with the presence of the woman they were both there to remember. Erica felt the familiar ache, the grief for the mother who had given her life, who had chosen her name, who had shaken a silver rattle and dreamed of a future filled with light and colour. But for the first time, the ache did not feel isolating. Standing beside Linda, she felt it was a grief they held in common, a love for the same person, though from different shores of the same devastating river. "I feel like I have two mothers," Erica said, the words coming unbidden, clear and true in the spring air. "One who gave me life, one who lived for mine." She looked at Linda, who had turned to her, tears shimmering in her eyes. "It's confusing. Sometimes it feels like I'm being pulled in two directions, but other times it just feels like more, like my heart had to make room, and it did." Linda's composure, so carefully maintained, fractured. A tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. She had spent 2 decades haunted by a ghost, fearing its power. "I was always afraid," she confessed, the words a raw, unburdening sigh. "Afraid that if you knew about her, about how vibrant she was, how much you were loved, that you'd love them more. That what we had would feel like a consolation prize, a replacement for the real thing." Erica heard the depth of that fear, the insecurity that had festered alongside the love. She understood now that the lie had been built not just to protect her, but to protect them, to shield the fragile family they had built from what they perceived as a superior, tragic claim. She reached out and took Linda's hand. It was cold, trembling slightly. "Love isn't a pie, Mom," Erica said, her voice gentle but firm. "There's not a limited amount where one person gets a bigger slice. There's enough for all of you. For Maria, who made me, for you, who raised me. It doesn't take from one to give to the other. It just expands." The metaphor, simple and clear, seemed to hang in the air between them, a truth so obvious it had been invisible in the shadow of their fear. Linda's grip on Erica's hand tightened, as if clinging to the words themselves. She looked from Erica's face to Maria's headstone and back again, as if finally seeing the connection not as a threat, but as a bridge. It was not a perfect fix. The fractures in their family were deep, the glue of therapy still fresh. The hurt of the deception was a scar that would always be there, sensitive to the touch.